have 10:15, so I think we'll start to get going here. When my husband, who speaks at a lot of conferences, saw which time slot I had, he said, "Uh-oh, that's really bad. You are the only thing standing between those people and lunch." So we'll try to make sure that we're done on time so I don't interrupt your lunch. He did say it's better than the time period right after lunch when everyone just wants a nap.
Yeah, we did just have snacks.
Well, that should, yeah.
We have lots of sugar.
That'll keep us working. My name is Maiwald. I've been homeschooling for about 12 years. I was educated as a Lutheran school teacher and taught in Lutheran schools for about 6 years before our older son was born. And I'm also a church musician. I play organ and direct a choir at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Hancock, Maryland. If you look in western Maryland at the really, really skinny part of Maryland, that's where our church is. So we have a lot of people from West Virginia and Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland. My husband, Eric, is an information security analyst. He works for a company called Burton Group. Because they're in Salt Lake City and we're in Maryland, he gets to work at home. So he's been really involved, especially the last few years in our homeschool. Great benefit to us. We have 2 boys. Our son, Stefan, is 18. He's headed to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York this fall with a Navy ROTC scholarship. So all those who say homeschooling really isn't acceptable in the outside world can look at things like that. It's fun to brag about that. He is going to study aeronautical engineering, and he hopes to fly helicopters in the Navy one day. And we have a younger son, Joel, who is almost 15, and he's working on getting his private pilot's license one day. I don't know what he'll ever do with that other than be a pilot for his own enjoyment. He's also a percussionist and has a number of other interests. And he'll be going into 10th grade this year. We live on a 59-acre hobby farm, it could probably be called, in central Maryland. So if you like talking about goats and things like that, that's probably my second favorite topic. You'll see me another time. If you're looking for a homeschool expert, this is the wrong place. I am not an expert on how you should homeschool your children. I'm kind of an expert on how my 2 should be homeschooled, and that's even questionable. Nobody can look at different homeschool families and say that one's right and that one's wrong. Every family is so different, and you really have to kind of find your own way and find what's right for your family. And that often means changing things year after year, too, and reevaluating. And I want to stress that because there's a lot of books and things you can read that say, well, these are the good things to use, the good curriculum to choose, and you may find that that wasn't right for you, and that's okay. So don't feel that there is one way to do this. What I hope to offer instead of telling you the right way to do it is to offer a lot of encouragement and to offer some ideas for you to think about as you choose what things will be right for your children and your family. So I do want to look at a little bit of theory and practice. My approach is slightly different to that from what we heard yesterday, but they are intertwined. My theory side is very brief. When we homeschool, especially classically, we expect to have the perfect homeschool family. We want the perfect set of children that are just adorable in every way and well-educated. And as I told my friend whose children these are, it only would be better if they were all wearing matching outfits that Mom had made in her free time. They actually have another sibling now that was born about a month ago. So there's 10 of them now. But the problem is that most of our lives look very different from the perfect homeschool family. Most of our lives look more like this. So how do we put all these perfect goals into practice? And it's not always about the curriculum we're going to use. It is about some concrete things that we can keep in mind as we teach our children. The other problem that we encounter as homeschoolers, and I find this more prevalent among the homeschool community than anywhere else, is that there are a lot of myths about classical homeschooling. They are all thoroughly convinced that we have our children chained to the textbooks, and that's how we spend our day. And these are my children. Joel on the left and Stefan on the right. And that's how we spend our day, and it's all textbook. We have a schedule. I should have put them in uniforms or something, probably, too. And we want to dispel some of those myths because that perpetuates the idea that we're only forcing rote learning into them. We don't care if they understand things. We don't let them follow their own interests. We have no flexibility in our daily life, so if it's school time, we have to be doing school. And that we just end up with automatons that don't know how to think for themselves. And also, we're going to squelch any enthusiasm for learning, especially if we start this too young. And I hear that mainly from other homeschoolers when they look at what they think we are doing as classical homeschoolers. So I want to dispel some of those myths as we talk about this as well. We need to begin with our goals and the philosophies that we have, and we've already been hearing a lot about that over the last not quite a day that we've been together. And I think those are the goals that we have to have in mind, again, being more important than which math curriculum we might choose. There are a lot of places that you can go to learn about what classical education is. We're hearing a lot about that this week. I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about that in particular. You can go read about the trivium and go read those things elsewhere. But instead, again, I want to think about some of those things that can make our homeschool a classically driven endeavor. And if you just want the nutshell version and you want to go off to one of those really interesting practical sessions that's going on right now, we'll give you the 2-second version. Learn everything. That should be our goal, both for ourselves and for our children, that we want them to learn everything. If you have time to stick around and want to hear the longer version, we'll add in the rest of the quote from Hugo of Victor. You will afterwards discover that nothing is superfluous, and I love the end of it. Limited knowledge affords no enjoyment. I love the end of that quote. So that's basically it. Now we go on to the longer version. We're not just striving, as we heard this morning from Dr. Vieth, to teach our children enough to earn a certain amount of money or to attain a certain occupation. That's what the world is doing in public schools. But we want to give them more. We want wisdom and virtue for our children so that they will be able to exercise all of their different aspects of vocation. Dr. Vieth led into that real well for me. We want education for the sake of education, not just for the sake of a future job. And I even see homeschoolers that I see going to the end as where they're headed for. The job is the important thing. I also hear a lot of homeschool parents who are kind of downplaying what their children need to learn. I overheard a group of moms talking once about their teenage daughters and how apology of science was too rigorous. They didn't need that. They were just going to become wives and mothers. And I'm thinking, well, at the very least, I would think that they may want to teach their own children, and knowledge would be good for that. And the benefits to themselves from a wide range of education is there no matter what they choose to do in life. And I thought that was very sad to hear that. I also hear a lot of homeschool parents say, well, what the public schools don't do this, that, or the other thing, so we don't need to do that either. Relax, it'll be fine. Give them, I don't know, an 8th grade sort of education, and they'll do fine in this world. And again, that cannot be our goal. Our goal needs to be for our children to learn everything and to strive for the highest. Dr. Hine talks about how classical education equips you to make a life, and then making a living is easy after that. And that's a real important thing to keep in mind. We can incorporate other goals into the idea of learning everything. Augustine talks about wisdom and eloquence, having our children be good citizens on earth and leading them toward citizenship in heaven. Dr. Vieth talked to us last year, as well as a little bit this morning, about the education of the free, where the term liberal education comes from. That the people who are going to be the thinkers and decision makers in our society need to have that well-rounded education. And then they don't need that education of the slaves. And those are the ones who needed to know how to perform their jobs and obey and follow rules and stand in line and raise their hand. We want our children to have education so they can internalize virtue. We want them to be able to participate in what Mortimer Adler called the great conversation. It's kind of handed down to them through the ages. They can get outside their own experience. If you look at what children are exposed to in schools and even in the culture, it's all very centered on children, like them. You know, all the literature and things that they're handed to read. They need to get outside their own experience and read about heroes and mythology and things like that to get them to think about the world in a way that's unfamiliar to them at first. Experiences of the whole world rather than just experiences of the one child. And we want to give our children the tools to become lifelong learners. As I send Stefan off to college this year, I say, well, you've got to stay for a couple more years. I'm not quite done yet. We need to do a little more of that and a little more of this. But then I take a step back and say, well, we've given him many tools so he can go and learn those things for himself, and he can be equipped to do what he needs to do out in the world. There's always a fear about hole in their education, that you're just not filling in all the blanks. But give them the tools, and they can do that on their own. We want our children to be able to feast on all the beautiful things that are in the world, not just from a narrow band of what's here and now, or gone in 30 seconds if you're on Twitter, and that's all that there really is. We want them to see a wider range of things. Okay, here's where you have the disadvantage of having people go before you, but I really did have my slide deck prepared weeks ago, So when I say things like, you might be a classical homeschooler if, I think he stole that from me. And as we go through this, I don't want this just to be a lecture, so please feel free to jump in at any point and ask a question or make a point. I don't want to just be the only one talking here. But I want to go through a couple of things in mind that we can now put into practice as we have that goal of learning everything. And the first one is, you have a plan. You need to be in charge of your child's education. And that's true whether you send him to private school, public school, or keep him at home. You are the one who God has given in charge of that child's education. So map it out. Sit down, think about what your goals are for those children, and start at the end. Start at high school at least, if not college. What do you want? What level do you want them to be at? What do you want to have covered in math and science and literature and things like that? And you work your way back. And then decide, well, where am I going to start now? And that doesn't mean that won't change from year to year. But have a plan in mind and keep track of how you're doing on that. One of the things we did in that regard is looked at how we wanted to do science before our children got into middle school. And we said we really wanted them to have 2 years where they could do upper level science in high school. So we want to finish your typical high school science by the end of 10th grade. We had already decided to use Apologia, so I mapped it back. And I said, well, that means beginning in 6th grade instead of 7th with general science, which Dr. Wild generally suggests for 7th grade. And I had an opportunity to speak to him. I was just barely getting into anything remotely classical in those years. And he said that was fine as long as our math was tracking so that you have algebra before you do chemistry. That was really the only thing that mattered as far as that goes. Okay, so we can do that. So we did that. We accomplished that. He had time for 2 years of math at the, or of science rather, at the community college after he did all the 3 high school biology, chemistry, physics, and we were really happy with that. Or we could have done AP at home and accomplished it that way as well. But that was one area where I felt like we had thought ahead and made a plan, and we were pretty happy with how that got executed. And again, it doesn't matter whether you do all of your child's education at your home or whether you're going to send them off for high school if you choose to do that, or if things get complicated in your family and you need to send them to public school at some other time, you're still in charge. And in a culture that says that you need experts to do everything for you, it's kind of hard to keep that in mind at times, but it's really something that's important. So another way that I tried to execute my plan is when I was preparing college applications or college transcripts for our son Stefan. And most of them were year by year, a list of the classes, a list of the grades, a list of the credits, though that was kind of meaningless because we had so many credits it really didn't matter. And I had one school that requested course descriptions. I kind of went and talked to all the admissions and said, we're homeschoolers, what do you want from us regarding a transcript? What will you consider official? Because in Maryland, we don't work through any school system. We can't have anybody sign off on our transcript. And one did say, well, if we could see some course descriptions, that would be really helpful. Pardon me. So I sat down and I started doing 9th grade math, science, English, and I didn't like the way that was falling together, so I scratched that. And I wrote instead, well, here's what we did for history throughout high school. And I led into it by saying we had been doing history in order, start at the beginning, go to the end, start at the beginning again, for many, many years, and here's how the high school years looked in that regard. And then I looked at math, and I said, well, we did algebra in 7th grade, geometry in 8th grade, and here's how high school math looked. So I tried to show that I had a cohesive plan for each subject, or science and art, that started way back before high school, and then here's what they wanted to see of what he did during high school. They seem to like it. I would like to know one day. It would be interesting to find out what they thought of that and how that looked to them. But I was really happy with how that turned out. And again, it was a more cohesive path and plan than just writing year by year. And that's really what you get in the public school. You just do one thing one year, and it has no relationship to what might happen the next year. The next thing that you need to do, if you might be a homeschooler classically, is you need to execute the plan. And this is my picture of what happens if you don't. Although it could have been children playing with Legos too, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But I will say plainly in this place, I do not think unschooling and classical education mix. If by unschooling you mean delight-led or child-led learning, because Johnny is not going to decide when he's 10 or 12 that algebra would be a really great thing for him to pick up and start working on. Our children are sinful, they need to be guided. We have people in the world telling us differently, telling us that all we need to do is get out of the way and stop being such a nagging influence and our children will just blossom. Well, that does not have the idea of original sin behind it. So that being said, I think a lot of people say they unschool when what they really mean is they don't necessarily have a real strict schedule for their day. They might have a list of things to do rather than a time in which we do everything. The kids can get up at 7, 8, or 9. They can do school in their pajamas, and they call it unschooling. I don't necessarily call that unschooling. But if you mean pure, Johnny will read when Johnny chooses to read, and if not, he can just go fishing, then I don't think that has a place with classical education. So, you might be a classical homeschooler if you liberally teach the liberal arts. We've been hearing about that already too. Everybody should learn everything. My son who wants to be an aeronautical engineer should still be well versed in literature and languages and all of those things. If I have a son who wants to be a plumber, he should still know calculus. Everybody should learn everything. So liberally teaching the liberal arts, we're teaching things that are applicable to being human, not just to what particular job they might have. And as you know, life is more than just our work or material goods. We need to show how everything fits together. When we started getting into the high school years, I worried because we didn't seem to have time for electives. And everybody who goes to high school takes a lot of electives. Thinking, well, we have, our hours for math and science and history, and where are we going to fit these things in? And then as I looked at what we were doing and what the public school in our area really was doing, I realized that was okay, that we didn't need to have time for electives because they were mostly hooey anyway. In our public school, it's not quite as bad as what you heard a few minutes ago this morning, but in our public school, when you are entering high school, you need to choose which high school completer program you're going to sign up for. One of them is designed by the University of Maryland system, and it's a list of the courses they feel are necessary for college entrance. The other one is called a career and technology completer for high school, and that means you're going to be rooted into what they would call vocational, work-ready, skill-related courses. Ambitious students can try both, but in 9th grade, these children are, I'm guessing, are really being influenced one way or the other to choose which way they're going to finish high school and what they're going to do after that. And I'm guessing those who get work-ready skills are not going to be the ones learning calculus and good literature and things like that. So they're being labeled really early on. And even beyond that, you need to choose one of 6 career pathways, and that's going to dictate your courses through high school. So that's where all their electives are coming from. And when I realized that, I said, well, I'm really glad we don't have time for electives. That just is not fitting into our idea of teaching everybody everything. And I was hearing a podcast that Mr. Kern did a few months ago on a website. I was listening to this earlier last week. And he talked about how we do ourselves and our children a disservice when we say, oh, he's just not a math person. Or I'm just not a music person, I can't do that. And while there are certainly areas that we are better at and other areas where we might need to work harder, we're going to do everybody a disservice if we talk that way about ourselves and our children hear us, or if we talk that way about our children. We just need to say things like, well, I need to work harder to understand math. Or music doesn't come as naturally for Johnny, but he's still working on it. So again, that fits in with this idea of teaching everybody everything. We also need to nurture language skills. And again, this is one of the things you're going to hear about a lot as you hear different people talk about classical education. My big thing on this is we need to model correct language. We need to speak and write correctly if we want our children to. And I have a lot of pet peeves that I have to sometimes bite my tongue about when I hear people saying that the lawn needs mowed or things like that. And there's certainly a difference between speaking colloquially at different appropriate times. And we live in a very rural area and have dinner with a lot of farmers. And it's okay if not every word that we utter is perfect then. But our children know the difference at this age. And we have modeled correct language to them over the years. A fun game is to find errors on public signs, which is all too easy to do. Just when you teach a lesson on the apostrophe, spend the next 2 weeks looking at all the misuses of the apostrophe in our world. There is one church that we drive by frequently, invariably has errors either in, well, it always has errors in theology, unfortunately, but often has errors in grammar or spelling. And while it's difficult to construct a sign like that, if they do it the wrong way on both sides of the church sign, they probably meant it. So model correct language. I was even listening to a speaker on classical education, and she misused, I would say she misused an adverb, but it was more that she didn't have the adverb where it should have been, and my children would have said "lee" at the end of that sentence. And I thought, she's putting this out on the internet for people to listen to, and had an incorrect sentence there. So there's certainly times when we need to model that, and writing correctly too. Knowing the difference between writing a story where two friends are talking to each other, which can be more casual, and writing an opinion essay where they need to be a little bit more formal. I use a real old Warner's English Grammar and Composition for our English, and it makes the distinction between what's really correct and what's kind of used pretty often and things are sliding into, but isn't quite the correct way to do it, so the children understand the difference between the two. Obviously, we also want to keep in mind the idea that classical education is language-based, not visual-based. Our world is very visually oriented right now, and quick flashes, too, bringing in Latin and Greek. And it all goes back to the fact that God gave us His Word. God made us people of the Word. He gave us His Word in Scripture and in Christ. And that's why words are important to us and really part of us. We want our children to master the material at the proper stage. We don't want them to master the methodology or the teaching technique. If any of you were trained as teachers for public or for Lutheran schools, you took a lot of methods classes, and you were taught how to teach a lot of different subjects, but you weren't necessarily taught what to teach. It was usually method-based, not content-based. Teachers do a lot of reading of techniques in trade journals. Most teachers don't do a lot of reading on content. I found that in myself, too, as I began homeschooling. It's a lot of fun to read books about homeschooling and just how other people are doing it, and that's a great way to get started, but you get weaned off that as time goes by, and you find yourself reading more chemistry and history and literature to keep up with what you're trying to do with your children, and less about how to homeschool. So we want them to master the material, we want them to learn it thoroughly, and we kind of need to do some of that ourselves. We may not be able to keep up with everything that they are doing, but we certainly need to make an effort to do that and to keep up with the content. We might be classical Lutheran homeschoolers if we don't rely on textbooks. Like our myth showed, many people think we do just textbook, textbook, textbook. But we want the riches of all the different sources that there are. We used Veritas Press history cards when the children were young, and they were a wonderful thing to hang a lot of other reading on. If they were really little and they just heard the story on the card, that was fine. If we could delve into things as they got older and add other primary sources or books about that time period, go to the library and clean out the shelf on Egypt, it was a wonderful way to just jump off. And then later on we used the Western Civilization book by Jackson Spielvogel in the same vein. We're continuing to use that with our younger son in history, where it's a jumping off point into all sorts of other things. My husband put together an American history outline of just different chunks of here's all the events, here's all the people in American history for different time periods, here's some good literature written during that time or authors from that time period, and we use that as a similar jumping off point. So textbooks certainly have a place. You're probably going to want a textbook for math and probably for science, especially in the older grades, but you don't want to rely on them. And as I mentioned science, let me also say, classically, you don't need to do any kind of formal science with younger children. And that seems to be, from what I'm reading, really the kind of agreed upon standard. Dr. Weil, I don't know how much he leans toward classical education in particular, but he will say the same thing. Now, if you look at Apologia Ministries, which he started, they do have elementary curriculum. I think that was because of pressure from homeschool moms who said, well, we have to have something to do during the younger years. But in the younger years, lots of nature study, going for walks, keeping tadpoles, books on anything that interests them, astronomy, whatever it may be related to science, but keep that just kind of fun and informal at least until 6th grade, I think. And then you can pick up the textbook. And I do think ecology is wonderful. I haven't looked at a lot of other science since that came out. But I will say that as my son went into college chemistry and physics courses at our community college, he did feel well prepared for those by the high school apologia courses. But keep that nice and light. And that's a great idea. You don't need a textbook for science in 3rd grade. Just go have fun with whatever's around and whatever's interesting to that child. Lots of biographies, primary sources, you know the drill. One of the reasons that Jackson's Spielvogel textbook is really nice for high school is it has a lot of excerpts from primary sources all through it. So you do get a lot of that, even if you're using more of a textbook approach for that. Yes?
I just wanted to mention I recently read Joel Brondus's book on I can't remember now, it's about treasures.
No greater treasure.
Yeah, No Greater Treasure. Luther had a lot to say. It's just excerpts of Luther and Langton on education. And he had a lot to say about child's play and keeping it light for younger children and not overburdening them. And something he said interestingly, I thought, was that sometimes people will pile on more learning than the kids are really able to digest, but they do it for their own reputation.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, and I think that's another one of those myths about classical homeschoolers is that, we're just chained at the table from 7 till 4, even if they're very young. Yes?
Yeah, my son loves science. And since school takes place mostly during winter and there's nothing to look at, we do formal science.
Mm-hmm.
It's his favorite subject. We have no zoo nearby either.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of people feel they have to, choose 7 textbooks for elementary school and make sure they get through them. If your son is enjoying that, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But there doesn't have to be anything formal, and I wouldn't worry about tests and grades and things like that at that point. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I was blessed to get a box of my grandfather's old books, and I was amazed at how classically they were written in the early 1900s. And he had a whole set of, and they were high school books, but it was on agriculture.
Oh, yeah.
And it mixed in math and science and all of this together. And I teach 5th grade. I got that book out, and we were working the acreage problems.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful.
But basically for science, it was, I know, isn't that great? But basically for science, it was, like you were saying, it was a lot of studies. Go out in the field, grab some bugs, draw them, and I kept thinking that is so appropriate for small children, even to, well, what do you see that's different from here to here? What bug is different? How are they different? How are they the same?
And there are a ton of good books to help with that, too. The one that comes to mind is, I think it's Anna Comstock, The Study of Nature. Handbook of Nature. Handbook of Nature Study, that's what it is. I bought that because I wanted it. I didn't care if the kids wanted it, but when you look about tadpoles, it'll tell you what to feed them and things like that. It'll have questions and observations for the children to make. And that's not a textbook, but you certainly can pull something out of there if they're interested. Or just raid the library shelves, whatever sparks them this week, and it'll be something different in 2 weeks, and that's fine. You don't have to say, well, we're going to study astronomy for 3 months, because they may not be interested in it for that long. And then we don't worry about finishing the book either. If any of you taught in schools, you were very concerned about whether or not you're going to finish the book by the end of the year. And most of us didn't when we did teach in schools, and we worried that the teacher in the classroom next door was, and we were going to get in trouble. But if you use a textbook as a jumping off point, it doesn't matter. My older son and I did economics, just kind of an introduction to economics for both of us, because I didn't know a lot about it either during the spring semester. And we started with a textbook that I found free. And used it to understand some of the terminology and the general concepts. And when we got bored with it, we stopped and went and looked online for lectures and discussions. And there certainly is enough in economics right now to keep interesting discussion. He's an avid Glenn Beck listener, so he had other things to think of. In fact, I think you, Kathy, were mentioning The Forgotten Man on the Stern list once. And he said, oh yeah, I heard about that, you have to buy that, Mom. And I had never heard of it. So we bought that book, which is about the Great Depression and kind of a new look back at that. So that certainly fit in with economics. And we didn't get back to that textbook ever, but that was okay. And I didn't have test grades for it, and that was okay. I knew what he knew, and I knew how he had worked on it, and I could give him a grade accordingly. The other thing that then we teach our children is not to trust the textbook as an expert. We learn to recognize the biases. And it doesn't matter whether it's a primary source or not, there are still biases. You know, sometimes we think, well, you use the primary sources and then you don't get the bias of the history textbook writer. Well, if you read accounts from 2 different soldiers on different sides of the Civil War, you definitely can compare the biases that are there. And then we can look for them, and once they're older, we don't have to be afraid of that kind of conflict. We can pick up something that might be more liberal than we would agree with and say, well, show me where things come out. Even in the Jackson Spielvogel, which I absolutely love, every period of history, nearly, he has a section on women and how they were repressed and how they were told by the church they should just stay home and have children. And so we got to chuckling about that by the end of the book, because you could predict when he'd get into his little chapter on women. So we can look at those biases and teach our children to recognize them, especially as they're older. And I think we kind of want to avoid them a little more when they're very young. And this is another, the next point is one that I think Mr. Kern kind of jumped on last night, and I was saying, no, don't go any further. But he didn't have the really cool picture. One of my absolute favorite paintings. He's got them under his arm and between his knees, and he's just trying to devour as many books as he can at one time. Someday I'm going to have to buy a print of this one. We need to read. This goes back to being language-based. And the one thing I would wanted to say the most and stress, I will, even though Mr. Kern already said it, read to your children and don't stop. I have an 18-year-old. When I close the book, we have a very long drive to church. When I close the book, because my voice is getting tired on the way home, you mean you're stopping? What do you mean you're stopping? We have, as I said, a very long drive to church. We travel 70 miles each way so that we can attend a confessional church, which are difficult to find in our neck of the woods. And so years ago when we began doing this, we just started picking up a book to bring along. And we try to read classic books that, at the time especially, were a little bit above the reading level of our children. You stretch the vocabulary, you're giving them things that they can't necessarily do on their own at that point. They have a familiarity with that. And we finally started writing them down, and we have a big list of classic literature, some not as classic as others, but pretty much classic literature that we've read aloud together. So when my husband was giving a graduation speech, we had a little graduation ceremony for our son, and we had put up 3 big flagpoles that he was standing in front of, and he was making some literary references in his speech and said something about, well, I could talk about the whiteness of the flagpoles. Well, we had all suffered through Moby Dick together, and the chapter of on the whiteness of the whale was just the funniest to us. So, as we said, I think our family was the only one who got that. But we have all that context that we can refer back to. And we liked some of them better than others. Some of them I looked at and said, I can't believe I read that whole thing out loud. I discovered that when I was actually teaching in a classroom. Probably my first job, although I think it was my second school that I remember it most from, especially the 6th graders. I would have a book going all the time with them, and I can't say that they were always great literature back then. You know, like with the 4th graders, I would pull out Tales of the 4th Grade Nothing by Judy Blume because it was cute, and they were just getting into 4th grade, and they thought it was fun. But I would always have a book on my desk that we were working on, and if we had an extra 10 minutes here or there, I would pull it out. Well, they absolutely loved it, even up to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, because nobody did that with them anymore. And this was at a private school with well-to-do parents who were very on top of spending time with their children, but it just didn't occur to them that, well, they can read on their own. I don't need to read to them anymore. That is so important. If you are trained in teaching in a school, at one point you were handed the reading program. And I remember being handed the stack with the huge teacher's guide and the vocabulary and the reading comprehension. And I actually was a music education major. Didn't find a job teaching music full-time, so did find a school that needed a 4th grade teacher. And I thought, well, that sounded like fun. And I really did love that. I really did enjoy being in the classroom. But the thing I hated the most was trying to figure out this reading program. Well, the reading program taught reading as a skill. It did not teach reading as a way of gaining content or enjoyment or anything. And the thing that frustrated me the most was you would get part of a book, and then you move on to a different part of a different book. You never read anything in complete wholeness. You just read little excerpts from Little House on the Prairie, because it was just to demonstrate a skill. You were going to learn a certain set of vocabulary words, you were going to learn a certain concept in reading comprehension, and then you were going to move on. The book didn't matter. Fortunately, both of my principals were very flexible in what they allowed us to do in the classroom. So when I ditched the reading program early on in the first one and never touched it in the second one, I didn't have a problem with that. And I pulled out The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we read it. And I pulled out other books through the year. And we still learned vocabulary words, and we still learned reading comprehension. But that was a side benefit to reading the story. And I'll be honest with you, and I don't know if I can say this with everybody listening who's more classically educated than I, but I don't always worry about how much my kids understand or can spit back or can analyze out of the books that we read. Mostly I want to expose them to a wide range of literature. And whether or not the green light at the end of Daisy's dock really does mean anything in Great Gatsby is debatable. We always kind of look at it and say, well, did the author really mean that anybody, or did somebody just make that up farther along the line? But mostly I just want them to have read it. So if there's a reference to it, they understand that. It's going to have things for them that Cliff Notes might not be able to bring out. So they might find other treasures in there that you might not even think of. And a lot of the big literature they're going to read again anyway in college, and they'll have a handle on it. The other point I want to make is don't wait until they're older to read advanced literature. And by that I mean give it to them many different times in many different ways. Start with a children's book about the Odyssey. And then read the children's Homer when they're in middle school. And then when they read the real thing, it's not intimidating to them like it will be to you. Because you didn't do all that. It's a familiar story. Homer's an old friend. And there are wonderful books about Shakespeare. Play plots. One is Beautiful Stories from Shakespeare for Children by E. Nesbitt, and Charles Lamb also has a book on Shakespeare stories. So read them when they're very young. When they see the play or read the play later on, it's not so intimidating. They're already really familiar with what's going on. It's kind of like learning the libretto of an opera before you try to sit through the whole thing. Gives you the same benefit. Foster lifelong reading habits. This is not anything I have to tell homeschoolers, because if anything, we always talk about how can I fit in one more bookcase. And there was actually a conversation among some of us years ago about the insulating our value of bookcases. We always have that problem. If you ever come to Baltimore, there is a free bookstore in downtown Baltimore right near the Johns Hopkins campus. They're only open on the weekends. They take in donations, and you can carry away as many as you can possibly take. And they have a lot of fiction, but they also have a bunch of history and military books and things like that we usually end up with. My sons will come out with 60 books each, and they'll be racing Dad for the military section, and that's a lot of fun. So have children like that, have them want to have books around, even if they don't get to read every one, just the idea of owning all these books and having them there, and especially older books. So read whenever you can. We read constantly in our family. It sounds horrible. We read our own books during breakfast and lunch because we're together for all 3 meals. So we just have a habit of having a book going or a magazine going at the table. Dinner time we always talk, and we talk lots of other times. But that's one thing that's been okay for our family. And everybody, we used to call my son Stefan Nose in Book. We were convinced that if he ever got lost as a small child, he would have no idea how to get home if somebody picked him up and was going to bring him home, because he was always reading in the car. He never knew where we were going or how to get there. So can't even talk about that one enough. You might be a classical Lutheran homeschooler if you talk to your students, and that seems kind of obvious. But by that I mean don't worry about a lot of tests and grades and evaluations. You want them to write. But whether or not they can fill in the blank in the multiple choice, yeah, you need to do some of that, because in our world they're going to have to take SATs and they're going to have to know how to do a test. But that doesn't have to be your only measure. Your primary measure should be, what do your children know? What can they say back to you? What can they talk to you about at the dinner table? And that's why I chose the dinner table, because that's where most of that will probably take place. We can get too bogged down in the process as teachers and kind of lose sight of the wonderful conversations that we can have. And you can still come up with a grade from that. Having now gotten a child into college, I can tell you that nobody cares what grade I gave for a particular semester of history in 8th grade. And they're not going to come back and say, well, how did you come up with that A? If that's what I gave. Nobody came back to do that either. And, you're going to be fair, and often if you involve them in that process, they'll be even harder on themselves than you might imagine. I didn't grow up with a lot of conversation about things going on in the world around the dinner table. And our children are, and I'm really thankful for that. And I think that's important. We also want to teach the big picture. We want to teach facts within the framework of a larger context. We're going to show how one lesson links to another, not just we're done with that chapter so we move on. And again, we're comparing what we might do to a more progressive approach that is very isolated and doesn't teach how things mesh together. And as Dr. Beef said, we're showing how everything will relate to vocation. We don't want to worry about just being done with something and moving on, and we want to show how math and science are related. We're going to teach the grammar of a subject first before we move on to the rhetoric of a subject. But we're still going to show them the purpose and show them how things relate together as they're able to understand it. We don't teach isolated math facts. We show them how multiplication and addition are really the same thing, just a shortcut. You teach it within a context. Even a lot of textbooks will teach them how to do certain things in math. I was even looking at a chemistry book, I think, that taught, rather than teaching how to manipulate an equation, it was just teaching them to memorize all the different permutations of that equation. So they never learned how to do it or why one was the same as another. They were just memorizing how to plug it in. And there's nothing wrong with the memorization, but you have to know how it works too. And there are certainly some math and science programs that do that a little bit better than others. Same idea with teaching history from beginning to the end, before they can really understand how beginning to end works, and showing them on timelines how things fit together when they're too young to grasp it, because when they can grasp it, it'll be there, and we're not going to be able to predict when that moment might be. I think that also teaches critical thinking, rather than getting out your critical thinking workbook that is kind of isolated exercises that don't seem to relate to anything else. You learn critical thinking when you're thinking mathematically and geographically and scientifically and all of those things. It develops within the content. I don't think it develops separately from that. You're showing how science and math and music, for example, are closely related together. I don't know if you have ever watched, I think it's on Discovery Channel, a show called Time Warp. But they used high-speed cameras to slow down all kinds of ordinary things. And one of the things they showed was guitar strings an octave apart from each other. And you could see, when they slowed it all down, how the one that was an octave higher was vibrating exactly twice as fast, with waves that were exactly half as long. And yeah, you can teach that out of a science book, but that was really cool to see that too. And then you're saying, well, that's science, that's math, that's music, it's all related together. We're not teaching them as isolated things. That also will teach our children how to think. Most schools today are teaching them what to think. And while we certainly are going to show them truth in many areas, especially in theology, we still want them to know how to think and to discern things for themselves. We might be classically educating our children if we're not afraid to have them memorize. And again, we're memorizing within context, but we are having them memorize, and when they're young, they just soak that up. Your children memorize anyway, whether you like it or not. You want to have a little bit of control over that. I have an almost 15-year-old who can watch a movie once and recite lines from it for the next month. He's very gifted in that. We often accuse him of not having an original thought, because often it's just a quote. Lutheran catechesis from the Concordia Catechetical Academy is a wonderful example of classical education, and Dr. Bees talked about this a little bit too. When they're very young, you have a learn-by-heart schedule for Bible stories and verses, and for hymn stanzas, and for pieces of the catechism. If they ask a question, you're certainly going to answer it. We're not saying, well, no, you just have to memorize now, we'll learn that when we get to the logic stage.
I would like our congregations to learn more about that. I'm teaching, I guess it's 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade Sunday school, and I'm having to memorize the catechism now.
Yes.
Because I think that's why we lose so many of our 7th and 8th graders, because it's so boring for them to just...
It's hard for them at that age.
And just memorize,
Yes.
when they really are more interested in the logic stage at that point.
Yeah, it's kind of a different topic there, but I think every father should be handed the catechism at the baptism and be told, here's your job, get started. And the learn by heart schedules in Lutheran catechesis have them memorizing the catechism in its entirety by the end of 3rd grade.
Yes.
And that's what our children did, especially the younger one. When I found out about, when that came out, actually, we don't have all the frills because we got it when it first came out, and that's all we bought. But when Joel went to confirmation, there were only 2 children in confirmation class, and Pastor ended up having it separately because Joel didn't need to do all the little memorization. He needed to get beyond that, do some other reading and learning from Pastor, whereas the other child had not had that. So yeah, that's really important when they're young, and that's when they can do it. I mean, I have still have videos of Joel when he was 5 rattling off some of the commandments, and he made mistakes that we still perpetuate. Like the end of the meaning of the 5th commandment, he would say, "Help and be friendly in every bodily need," instead of "help and be friendly." That we use the older language because they thought that was the right way to do that when they were very young. So we still kind of perpetuate some of those mistakes that they made as we recite it because I think it's really good. That's really important, and don't be afraid of it. They love to memorize things. They can memorize poetry and the Gettysburg Address and all kinds of interesting things, and then it'll be part of them. The Learn by Heart schedules are called that because it becomes part of your heart. And sometimes we're accused as Lutherans of just going through the motions, and you know how many times you stand in church and you recite something and then you were thinking about what you're going to make for dinner, and it may make you feel guilty, but on the other hand, isn't it wonderful that your heart could continue reciting that while your mind was elsewhere? That means it's part of you. And I think that's a gift too that is really a treasure we can give to our children. Obviously, we do want to pay attention to certain things, but I think that's kind of cool too. And you hear all that today, that we're not going to make children do that because it's not fun, and we're going to squelch their love for learning, and it's a horrible thing to do to your little ones. But definitely something we want to pursue, I think. We do want to expect rigorous work from our children in all aspects of their life. And that's another thing that goes back to the unschooling thing, is that, well, that's too hard, it's work, they're not going to have fun, we shouldn't make them do it. Well, yeah, we do need to make them do it. They do need to learn that, if you're going to hold down a job one day, you're going to have to work, you're going to have to get up and be there at a certain time. There are certain disciplines, and right now your vocation is student, so you are expected to work at that. And that doesn't mean they should never have fun. It doesn't mean that school has to go on for 7 hours every day for a first grader. But when you are working on things, let's work hard at that. And when we're done, we can go do something different. That does develop the virtue. Aristotle said virtue is the ability to act in accordance to what one knows to be right. And we're not fostering virtue for them to gain their salvation, but we're fostering virtue for them to help overcome some of their own tendencies that will help them function better in this world. So overcoming a tendency to be lazy and to want to just go fishing or play with Legos instead of doing hard work. We need to help our children develop that. I hear a lot about young people in the workplace who have this sense of entitlement, and I shouldn't have to really work hard, I'm just here. And I even heard on one program an employer say they expect to be applauded every time they show up for work, because they grew up in this culture that said, oh, you're wonderful, you're special, everything you do is just fine, but they didn't have to work for that. So do expect rigorous work, and then let them have the reward of separating work from play, not mixing the two, and then enjoying the play part of it too. Your family needs to study and learn together. We want to model lifelong learning to our children. That means that we need to be part of that too. We want to give them tools so that they will continue to learn. I'll use an example of 2 family members in our family, both women who are living alone and are retired. One of them is in her early 60s, and she doesn't really do anything. I suggested, well, go take a class or something, or how about some books to read? No, I don't want to do that. The other one, who is in her 80s, is constantly traveling. She loves world travel. She's actually been to all 7 continents, including Antarctica when she was 72. And I'm not a big traveler, so it's not something I aspire to do, but I think it's wonderful that she does that. She's always taking classes at the community college for senior citizens, going on tours. She is modeling lifelong learning for our children. The other one, not so much. So we want to show our children that it's not just something that ends with the end of your formal education. As any of you who are already homeschooling know, the big benefit of homeschooling is filling in all the holes in your own education. Most of us, or I might say all of us, did not receive a classical education. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute too. I didn't know, I thought I was well-read. I thought I was a good, intelligent student. I probably was intelligent, but I didn't know any history, really, very little. I didn't know science. I know that I didn't know any upper-level math because I said, no, I'm an English and music person. I'm not going to take any more math or science than I have to. In New York State, you could get away with geometry and biology and nothing beyond that, and you were done. So I didn't. And I did have teachers who said, you shouldn't do that, you should take these things. And they were right. I didn't care then because I knew it all. But we need to do it as a family. And that can even be conversations around the dinner table. When you're talking about current events or about what one of the children has read. And our children are old enough that they're teaching us now some of the things that they have read. My husband did some research papers in high school and college. He's very interested in military history. And he used the Samuel L. Morrison series on the naval battles during World War II, Pacific naval battles. And it's a huge 14-volume set. Finally found it online for a pretty good price, bought the whole set, brought it home not too many years ago. And Stefan, who was 14 at the time, sat down and read it, the whole thing, because he wanted to. And so now he can spout off all these tidbits about naval battles, probably much more than you ever want to know, because that was something that was interesting to him, and we had the books around. And now he teaches us that sort of thing. So then the next question is, how is this any different from a classical day school? What makes this homeschooling rather than what everybody else who's here this week is doing? And it isn't all that different. It's not different in the principles and the goals. It's not different in the kinds of things that can be done with the children. But on the other hand, it is different because we're doing this every day of our life and we're doing it all day. And again, that goes back to the myth that we sit our children down for school from 8 to 4 and then we're done. We're not going to learn anymore. But as you know, as parents, those learning times come at odd moments and all through the day. And certainly as classical educators, that's true too. We can model that lifelong learning better than the classroom teacher can. And they can, and they do, and that's wonderful. But they're going to see us all day doing that, not just for a time period when they're in a classroom. And we also are going to have more of an influence over our children than the teacher would. So we have kind of an advantage in that regard. It is different because we can have these goals in mind and we can be flexible in our schedule. Life has to happen too. And if you have a time when grandma's sick and we really need to take care of her, and that means we're going to take our books with us, but we probably won't get as much done, they understand that too, and they need to see that that's part of vocation too, taking care of grandma or whatever the case may be. We're flexible when it comes to school uniform, to outside activities that might fit into our lives, and we have that advantage over the day school. It is different because we can tailor our curriculum choices to each individual child, and that's the reevaluation. And as you know, if you've done this at all, it happens almost every day where you're saying, well, I'm not sure if this is working for this child. It worked for child number 1. Will it work for child number 2? But you can do that. You can tailor it. You can throw out half of it. You can just use the good parts that work for you. It's also different because most of the teachers in the classical schools are not teaching in a one-room schoolhouse with multiple grades, and you are. Teaching a lot of grades at the same time. And I think that's one of the benefits, because then when you do use something like Veritas Press History, you can do it at different levels. The younger children are just getting the card. The next older children might have a few books to read from the library. The older ones are going to add in some stuff from Jackson's Field Bogle and do some writing on it and take it to a different level. And you can do that. It's hard to do that with many children at once. I only have 2, and I can't speak to how do you manage doing it with 5. Many of you are better experts at that than I am. But it can be done, and I think that's wonderful because you get everybody working together on that, and the younger ones will learn from the older ones, and I think it'll work the other way around too. And it also is different because we have more time for our children to pursue their own goals. And certainly that's something that we don't squelch, although many people might think that we do because we have our set curriculum and you can't get outside of that, but they can pursue their own interests. They have time to do that. As I mentioned, our younger son has been pursuing his private pilot's license. He still has a year to go before he can solo because you can't do that till you're 16. But in the meantime, he's going to be ready. So that day, he may not be getting his driver's license that day, but he can go and do his solo flight that day. And we've had time to say, yeah, on Wednesday from 10 to 12:30, we can go and you can fly. He flies about once a month. And certainly Legos and fishing work into that too. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things as long as we're delineating when that can be done. So I think that classical Lutheran schools have the best that a school has to offer, and as homeschoolers, we kind of get the best of both worlds, if we feel that that's right for us. And when I started homeschooling, I was like a kid with a new toy, and I thought everybody had to homeschool because it was right, and everybody had to do it the way I was doing it because that was even better. And time and wisdom do temper that. There's nothing wrong with sending children to a school. There's nothing wrong with sending them to a public school as long as you're in charge of their education. Homeschooling is probably not right for every family, and it's something you have to decide, is it right for your family? And then we have this fear of, we can't do this. We don't have a classical education, so how are we possibly going to make it through and have educated children? And I can't tell you how relieved I was to come to CCLE last year and hear Dr. Hines say, well, of course I didn't have a classical education, and I'm trying to figure it out too. We're all learning right alongside our children, and I think that's the other myth that people outside of homeschooling have about us. Well, if you don't know all those things, how can you teach your children? And I do have family members who thought it was okay for me to teach my children because I was a teacher, but not because I was a parent. And if they only knew how little that teaching prepared me to actually homeschool. There's mostly crowd control anyway. We kind of talked about that as we talk about modeling lifelong learning, but it is going to be work. We have to educate ourselves. And I like to say that I try to start out 4 or 5 modules ahead of my children in science at the beginning of the year, and they start out behind, but it usually ends up closing the gap pretty quickly till I'm at the point of, well, which pages are we doing for chemistry for tomorrow? Okay, I'll make sure I read those tonight before we do that. But that's okay, because again, you're modeling lifelong learning to your children. You're modeling the fact that you're mom or dad, and you still want to learn all those things, and you find it exciting and interesting. I didn't know Latin, trig, economics, history. I didn't know any of those things before we started homeschooling. And there are a lot of resources. I'm going to give you a page with a few websites on it. I didn't bring as much as I would have liked to because I was flying. So a couple of things that I did bring that you're welcome to take a look at. This is the catalog from Memoria Press, memoriapress.com. They do Latina Christiana. That's kind of how they got started. They have some great logic books. They have online classes. My son has taken a couple of those. They also have interesting articles in their catalog each time, so it's kind of fun to look at. And then my really favorite one is Veritas Press. They're wonderful. Even if you don't want to buy a whole lot from them, they have reading lists for each age group, each grade level, that go along with the history that they recommend for that year. So you can get great ideas. And you can mix. You don't have to say, well, this is a 7th grade book. I can't have my child read it in 10th grade. You don't have to look at it that way.
Except when you look at that, the 7th or 8th grade list of books, you'll say, oh my God.
Right.
And you have to go back to Memoria Press, okay, and read their article, Multum Non Multa, which makes you feel a whole lot better.
Right.
It's the depth and not the number.
Right.
Just as Luther said, it's not the number of books that makes them young and well read, but a good book read often frequently or something.
Yeah, and that's really important. That's why I'm saying if you look back at the 7th grade list and want to pick books for 10th grade, that's really fine. In fact, I'm doing that coming up this year. It's great for ideas, and there's also quite a bit, they're very Calvinist, so there's a lot of Reformed theology in their book choices. So you may not want to spend a lot of time on the Westminster Catechism. You may want to spend a little time on the Institutes by Calvin when they're older, just so they have exposure to that and they can compare it to what Luther said when they're older and well-grounded. But it's a great resource just to say, well, what are some fiction books that relate to the medieval times? And then let me go see if I can find them at the library. So that's on the sheet that I'll give you too. Online courses are available for older children. That's the other thing with Veritas. They have a really wildly growing online academy. And Joanna Hensley, who's here with the 2 little children, Dr. V's daughter, does some teaching with Veritas. So if you're interested in that, she probably could tell you more than I could. But if you go on their website, they have, which I'll give you, they have some resources there. For yourself, there are a lot of books. One I would recommend is a book by Susan Wise Bauer called The Well-Educated Mind. You may be familiar with The Well-Trained Mind, which is her treatise on a bunch of ideas on how to educate children classically. Again, don't be intimidated by that one. A lot of people look at it and say, well, I can't do that. It has a schedule from 7 to 4 for a first grader. She didn't mean for anybody to actually follow everything to the letter. She meant it to be a bunch of resources for people to pick and choose. But then she wrote one called The Well-Educated Mind, which is for us. It's for people who never had a classical education and who would like to gain one as an adult. And she kind of guides you through some great books and things like that. And even if you just delve in and out of it, that's kind of a nice resource. A lot of people talk about high school as being something that's very intimidating, and well, yeah, we can homeschool up to 8th grade, but we can't do high school. You can do high school. There's nothing wrong with using resources outside your home, whether online classes or community college, tutors. If there's somebody at your church who's really good at one thing or another and they want to come and help your children, that's a great way to do it. Our community college is very welcoming to homeschoolers. If they can pass the placement tests, they can start taking classes when they're 14. And the placement test is roughly equivalent to getting 500 on the math and verbal SATs, just to give you a guide. So both of our sons have done that and have been able to start taking college level classes pretty early. We're not doing it to try to transfer a lot of credits. We just did it to show the outside world that as homeschoolers, our children can handle that level of material. And that kind of dual enrollment really helped when our son was applying for college, because they had outside faculty to look to for recommendations too, other than just mom. So that was really helpful. In some states, they'll pay for your credits if your children are in high school. I know in Illinois, we have some friends whose children are amassing quite a few credits during high school that they can transfer then to college. So it depends on your situation and what your community college will do, but it's something to look into as your children are older. I've been really happy with how that's gone. And they don't have to be, there's nothing particularly classical about calculus. So you don't have to say, well, it's not a classical college, I don't know if I want to do that. If you're just doing it for math or science, you might want to be a little bit more careful with history or English. But for some of the upper level math and science, it's been a great resource for us. I do especially like it when I hear parents talk about curriculum for Latin, for example, and they want to know what curriculum is really good for a teacher who doesn't know the subject, because that's showing that they're willing to learn alongside their children. Latina Christiana is a wonderful Latin curriculum from Memoria Press for parents who don't know any Latin. It moves nice and slow. It's not like a real quick pace like Wheelops. And there are a lot of Latin scholars around here that can tell you more about that too. Then my last question for you is, how can we help? The consortium has formed a team of homeschool parents, of which I'm supposed to be the head, I guess. And we are hoping to provide resources for homeschoolers who want to do it classically and Lutheran. One thing that's a little bit fuzzy to me is where exactly we need to go with it, in that there are a ton of resources out online right now anyway, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel by writing pages and pages again about what classical schooling is. In fact, I'll hand this out while we talk about this a little bit. So my question is, from a Lutheran perspective especially, what might be helpful to provide to people who are trying to homeschool classically? And it could be anything from, maybe we can do some reviews of different curricula from a Lutheran standpoint, or even provide folks that you could email or talk to as a kind of a consultant sort of thing. One thing we kind of started with is we're going to come up with a list of FAQs of questions that we think people might be asking. And some of the questions I addressed here today, like, well, how can I do this if I don't have that kind of an education? And we can provide a list of links and resources that will point you to that, rather than rewriting the whole thing on our page. But whether you talk to me about it now or you catch me another time during today or tomorrow, if you have ideas, we would love to hear them. So we would love to get a sense of direction for what would be helpful to people.
There is also a working group for curriculum development, so understand that.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to step on.
You'll be collaborating with them a lot, obviously, but just for the sake of discussion this morning, it might be more efficient to realize that.
So I think we need to figure out just how this group is going to be defined and what we're going to be able to do for homeschoolers that are out there. So if you have ideas as to what would be helpful, we would be much appreciative of hearing those. And let me give you my email address too, which I did not put on that sheet. It is the letter K, and then my last name, MAIWALD, @fred.net, FRED.net. We live near the town of Frederick, and it was a local ISP provider. So Maiwald @fred.net. And feel free to email me with other ideas regarding that.
So this is ideas for the consortium to help homeschool.
Yeah, what kind of things are you looking for as homeschoolers? How can we help?
I would just like to suggest that one of the things you could do is we have a token resources page at CCLE.org. It'd be neat to have people in the trenches really expand that thing and have categories of resources and stuff.
Okay.
Really beef that up.
So just compiling
Yeah,
other
yeah.
resources that are out online.
Frontline people can do that so much better than a few board members trying to help out.
And I just put together, this is just a smattering, there is so much out there. If you do a search on classical homeschooling, it's just, you could get bogged down for days and neglect your children and family. Starting with the consortium, of course, and the Circe Institute, Veritas and Memoria are there. Classical Christian Homeschooling is one that has live monthly lectures on literature. There's two that you have to be careful of there. One is classical homeschooling, the other one is dash homeschooling, and they're different websites. The second one, classical-homeschooling.org, has a lot of good resources, just fairly short readings on the different stages of the trivium and then what curriculum you might use for those stages. So I just found a bunch of them. Classical Conversations at the end is one that has, I'm still trying to figure this group out a little bit, so if you know anything about that, dive in. I know Mr. Kernan's been involved with them, but they have groups in all different areas in the country that you can be part of, and my understanding is that you would choose the level. It's all grammar, logic, and rhetoric, but they have other names for those levels. And you would bring your children there once a week, and there's a trained tutor that kind of directs what things you're going to do over the next week, which things you're going to memorize, and you come back next Thursday and you do your recitations, and then you go home and do the work again. So it's a little more structured. I think you do have to do all the math that they want to do. They use Saxon math, so if you didn't like that, you might not be comfortable there. It's a little more directed, and it seems to me it's for people who are intimidated by classical education, but it might be a good jumping off point to get them into it and have a little more direction from people who are trained. So that's what that last one is. Any other questions or comments?
You mentioned Latin. How much Latin did you teach?
I was afraid you were going to ask that. We started doing Latin, I think, in 4th grade for our older son, because that's when I started hearing that that would be a good thing to do. And he probably did, I want to say, 5 years or so. And our younger son probably did about the same in upper elementary and middle school, and kind of had a point where they said, I'm not doing that anymore. And in fact, one of the things I think I'm going to go home and do is try to make a deal with my younger son, who's done quite a bit of English grammar, and if I can do some more Latin for grammar, then maybe I can get him to do a little bit more of that.
Yeah, you can learn English by learning Latin.
Exactly. And he's at the point where I'm not too worried about the English grammar. I would have liked to do more. I think part of it was I got stopped at my own ability level, where I could just glean it on my own. And I was trying to buy resources on a shoestring rather than buy the whole wheelbox thing and do a group, that sort of thing. And that kind of stalled us out after a little while. But I would like to do more.
I'm not here to stop you.
Oh, that's all right. I think we're almost wrapped up anyway. Anything else? Yes.
We are brand new to homeschooling. 5-year-olds starting kindergarten in the fall. This is all tons of information. And I've been reading just books on methods in general. We know we want to do classical, and yet I'm reading about everything else and trying to figure out, can I do Charlotte Mason in a way with, classically, or parts of the philosophy, and I'm just trying to piece things together. You mentioned before, obviously, history, English. How do we decide, do we need to pick a classical curriculum for this particular subject? Are we free to not? Math, science, probably not. How do we make those choices?
I want others to jump in here on this too, especially you, Kathy. I think that when they're very young, you ease into it. I think that when they're that young, a little bit of reading, writing, and arithmetic is probably good, and then whatever else, reading stories together, doing
Play.
Yeah.
Play and read.
Yeah. And I don't think you need a lot of curriculum. I think that if you want to teach them to read, you get books out of the library. If you're more comfortable with the phonics approach, I used Alpha Phonics for our younger one, and not all the bells and whistles that I think they have now, but the really old book. I bought it used online, and it helped him get through that little hump of learning the phonics. The older one kind of went through that more quickly, but mostly we just got books out of the library and read them. Even math, you could get little Walmart workbooks. There's nothing particularly classical about how you do addition in 5 or 6-year-old. So you could do it on your own, or if you wanted something, you could get some workbooks. Or we actually did a Becca beginning in, I guess I began in kindergarten, but I started with her first grade book because I did want something for that. But
Yeah, and I heard that too. It sounds like a little bit more a relaxed approach, and yet memorization is so important at that age.
catechism.
So we're doing catechism
And computer memorization
and hymns, and not worry so much about poems, and I mean that can be part of the fun reading.
You know, have to get the nursery rhymes and the children's book of, Stevenson. Children's Garden of Verses.
Yeah.
You know, some great poems in there, but I would say, you know, in theory, we started homeschooling classically from the beginning, but I used a lot of Ruth Beachick stuff because it was play and it was reading and it was very elementary things, and by the time we were in the 2nd or 3rd grade, you could start getting into more of the more formal classical teaching. But the thing you don't want to do is squash them into routine and schedules too early, because that level of learning gets beat out of them pretty quickly.
They're curious about something.
Yeah.
I
wouldn't tell her tired
in
of
a
it.
row. I use that with my son in kindergarten. 5 in a row. It's literature based, and you read the same story for a week, and they have a fun activity that goes with it. It's different, and I really think that's why he loves to read, because my second boy, I did not teach kindergarten, and it took me 3 years to undo what he did in 1 year of kindergarten in school. So 5 in a row was very good. And I kind of backed up with my middle guy and did that, and he likes to read now. Not as much as his older brother, but I'm glad that he likes it, because it was sad for me that he didn't like reading.
I think when Luther was growing up, Luther taught 1 to 2 hours a day.
Right. I was just going to say that even when you add, you know, if you wanted to add Veritas Press in 2nd grade and start with the ancients, well, you can do that in 10, 15 minutes. Just read the card, and then the next day read a story about it. And, you know, it doesn't have, just because you're doing many different things doesn't mean they all have to take a long time either. But yeah, you should definitely be done by lunchtime until you get to, I think, 4th grade or 5th grade at least.
I totally agree with that. I teach 5th grade. And they're done by lunch anyway. So it's,
Especially if they're boys.
yeah, you gotta, yeah. And I have a 1st grader and a kindergartner going into 2nd grader, and I agree with what you said about the reading. And yeah, my daughter's not a reader because I think it was killed out of her.
Chilled out of them.
Yeah, and so now I'm going to take your 5 in a row, and I'm going to read
It's
like
very
that my
good.
son who is going into
It's good for
kindergarten.
boys.
Yeah, and and then it's true too, being even in a Lutheran day school and being a teacher in a Lutheran day school, you are still in charge of your own children's education. So yeah, but it's a lot of really good information.
All right, I'm ready.
Thank you very much.
Lunch line is open at 11:30, so you're welcome just to head over to the dining hall. We have lunch until 1, so you have a long time to visit the resource tables. So let's write you down on the list.
I want to use an internet connection and a projector.
This is a good one.
Yeah.